Welcome to Tell Us a Story, the podcast dedicated to the stories that connect us through our shared life experiences, as well as the stories that reveal the sometimes stark differences. Only by truly listening to one another can we bridge the gaps that divide us, fostering empathy, respect, and kindness with one another. Jan Powers began her career as a college professor in the late 1960s. Archaic rules from the Depression era, as well as the cultural biases of the time, only served as motivation for her to push the boundaries in her 49-year career in higher education. Jan's passion for teaching and her strong determination are clear throughout her story. Let's listen as Jan tells us her story.
This is Jan Powers. I'm retired from 49 years of teaching at Gettysburg College. When I was working in the summers at the National Girl Scout Training Center, the music director there was a really interesting woman who was working on her PhD at Columbia. And she was doing a PhD in Indian music. And so we became good friends. And I actually, on weekends, when we go into the city, I met some of her Indian friends. Actually went to Columbia and saw some of the buildings there and so forth. So I guess that was the first time I ever met anyone who had been considering a PhD. But then at Bucknell, my mentor, Mildred Martin, was a formidable woman professor, a specialist in T.S. Eliot. And she said to me one day, and I had told her that my intention was to become a junior high biology teacher, like my favorite teacher when I was going through school. And she said, "Have you ever thought of teaching college?" And I said, "Well, gosh, no. That's beyond me." And she said, "Well, what I would like to have you do is to teach one of my classes." And she said, "This is a class you're enrolled in. It's a Milton class." And she said, "You can pick which part of the syllabus you want to do. Just one class. I want you to try it out." So I didn't want to do Paradise Lost. That was too much to deal with. So we also had to read Samson Agonistes, which is the story of pulling down the temple on Samson's head. So I picked one of the lessons from Samson Agonistes, and I formulated a bunch of questions to ask, and we had a discussion, and it actually went pretty well. And she said afterwards, "Well, what did you think?" And I said, "Well, maybe I could do this." And she said, "Did you know the answer to some of the questions that you asked?" And I said, "No, but I thought maybe the class did." And she just roared. She just laughed uproariously, and she said, "That is skating on thin ice." I continued to do that, to ask questions that I didn't know the answer to, because sometimes the class gets into a really interesting discussion. And even though you may not come out with a definite answer one way or the other, you have probed the topic. And so I continued to skate on thin ice. I came in September 1963, and I had spent the previous year in Pakistan as a Rotary Foundation Fellow, where I learned a lot about Muslim culture and studied the Urdu language. So I was hired from Pakistan, sight unseen. So I arrived in Gettysburg, and the first thing that happened was I had an interview with Charles Gladfelder, who was dean of the college. And he, of course, is well known as a local historian and a notable presence in the history of the college as well. So I went to my interview, and he noted that I had come from Pakistan. He said to me, "I hope you don't have any idiosyncrasies." And I was floored. I had no idea how to respond to that. I didn't know what he had in mind. I said, "Well, probably not." But I began wondering. And that whole first semester, I wondered, should I not wear pants on campus? Should I not wear sandals on campus? So I'd been wearing sandals for a year in a warm climate. Do I need to wear stockings and heels on campus? How do I prove that I don't have any idiosyncrasies? Well, years later, I think I probably did have some and still have some, but that was my introduction to Gettysburg. I was very young. I was frequently mistaken for a student. For instance, in those days, we had weekly chapel. So I would go into chapel and they'd hand me a card as if I were a student. So I thought, well, I need to make sure that doesn't happen again. So I began to wear earrings. I began to wear heels along with those stockings. Women really weren't wearing pants on the job in those days. I was hired to teach freshman English, which meant I had 3 sections of freshman English and one other terrific course that I'm sorry Gettysburg no longer teaches, which was Literary Foundations of Western Civilization. And although I do object to the fact that we weren't teaching Asian civilizations along with it, it was an excellent grounding in everything from Greek tragedy, Beowulf, Faust. I mean, it was an amazing 2-semester course. So I loved teaching that, and I was learning a lot about works that I really hadn't studied very hard. I had read most of them, but I hadn't studied them. And then I had these 3 sections of freshman English, and we had to teach some sort of a novel or a novella or something along with all of the grammar and whatnot. So I chose to teach Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, since I recently had come from a part of the world which was not well known to the West. But the problem with 3 sections of freshman English was I did pretty well remembering everybody's names and interests and, question and answer styles for the first 2 sections, but the 3rd section just became a blur. I couldn't remember the names. I couldn't remember who had said what or what sort of things they were likely to say. So that was a tough load. And these days, faculty members only teach 3 courses. They don't teach 4. I then made the mistake of getting married. Now, you might not think that was a mistake, but at Gettysburg, it was, because they were still operating under some older rules, which really came into existence at many institutions during the Depression. And the rule was that only one member of a family could hold a full-time job at the corporation or the college or the university or whatever. I decided the best thing for me to do at this point was to go work on my PhD, because I had come from Pakistan with just an MA from the University of Michigan. Never mind, I had studied with one of the great Shakespearean experts, G.B. Harrison, who had edited the volume of Shakespeare that I used as an undergraduate at Bucknell. And I remember going to G.B. Harrison and saying to him, look, I've got a problem. I've just won this fellowship to go to Asia, and I really had planned to continue on my PhD here at Michigan. And he said, go to Pakistan. He said, you will never understand the Middle Ages or even the Renaissance in Europe if you don't go to a country that is in that stage of development. And you will appreciate the kinds of things that were going on in the marketplace in medieval and Renaissance England. Now, it turned out that G.B. Harrison had served in the British Army in India. So he knew exactly what he was talking about. And so I followed his advice and took the fellowship to Pakistan. So I went this time to the University of Wisconsin to work on my PhD in English and Indian Studies, now usually commonly called South Asian Studies because it covers more than just India. And I went there because my husband was working on his PhD at Northwestern, and Chicago was not far from Madison, Wisconsin. So I came back to Gettysburg, only to discover that Gettysburg was part of a consortium of 6 colleges that had been awarded a Ford Foundation grant. Well, actually 2 Ford Foundation grants, one in Chinese studies and one in Indian studies. And so I was, of course, the likely candidate for the Indian Studies grant, and we met at least once a month. We met with scholars in the field. We looked at syllabi. We developed our own syllabi. And it was a great, continuation of my work in Pakistan and my work in English and Indian studies at Wisconsin. But it turned out, of course, there was still this problem about the married woman. Can 2 members of the same family be employed? And there were 2 full-year courses added in Indian studies, which I taught. One was Civilization of India, and one was Literature of India, which was my special interest. But I could only be a part-time faculty member. And so I taught these courses for a pittance, let's say. But I was having a good time because this is what I wanted to teach. And the other thing was I had a couple of babies. So teaching part-time really worked out pretty well. We would hand off the kids. I taught in the morning, my husband taught in the afternoon, and we'd do a handoff in the middle of the day. We made it work. The college decided they wanted to start an Asian Studies committee to sort of oversee the program, the 2 programs, actually. The Asian Studies committee could only be composed of full-time faculty members. Now, there was a problem. But hey, Janet Powers, Gemmell, was married to a full-time faculty member. Let's put him on the Asian Studies Committee. I have to say, Mike knew nothing about Asian studies. Nothing at all. In fact, he had never traveled outside the country. So there would be this, he would come home with the agenda. Do we have any items to add that I could suggest? Well, sometimes we did. He would come home with the meeting notes. Did I have any commentary? Well, that would be taken back. This was the really stupid, I have to say, attitude that Gettysburg was taking for a long time. I mean, they finally gave this up. But I was part-time for many years until they finally decided, well, it's okay. we can have a full-time faculty member and a full-time husband faculty member. I guess I was sort of shocked at this because I had gone to school at Bucknell. I didn't think Gettysburg would be much different from Bucknell, but in fact it was. Because when I came to Gettysburg, there were just 5 women full-time faculty members. 2 of them were in the Spanish, teaching Spanish, 1 of them in French, 1 in music, and 1 in English. Now, the situation was not too different at Bucknell. There were probably 6 full-time faculty members when I went to school there, but they were very powerful women on the faculty. And one of them was a scientist. She was in the biology department. So I guess I assumed that it would be the same at Gettysburg. But I think Gettysburg was still, when I came there in the sort of the teacher-preacher mode, they were mostly producing teachers and preachers in their graduates. That was changing in the 60s while I was here. But, Bucknell had already gotten beyond that stage. So there was definitely a difference. And Bucknell was bigger, but not by much, maybe by 1,000 students than Gettysburg. The other problem they had with my India courses was where to put them in the curriculum. I was nominally a part of the English department because I was occasionally still teaching a freshman English course, but there was this Literary Foundations course, and they decided to create a new category called Interdepartmental Studies. So the Literary Foundations courses and the CC courses, which were, again, these were really wonderful courses based on programs at Columbia. And they were interdisciplinary courses. And CC was sort of combination of economics, history, and political science. And the Literary Foundations course was mostly, I think, taught by people in the English department, some of the language departments, and religion. So the IDS department became my home, and I had the title of Adjunct Professor of Interdepartmental Studies. So that was my identity. Now, there were some other issues because the women's movement was sort of beginning to emerge toward the end of the 60s as well. And Gettysburg at that time had no lunch facilities for faculty other than the snack bar, the bullet hole. I mean, the students had their dining hall, but faculty did not eat in the dining room with the students at all. So they developed a sizable brown bag group in, I think they were meeting in the Gladfelder at that time, I don't know, in one of the departmental rooms. And the people that were brown bagging seemed to be all men. And I was bringing my little brown bag. Now my kids were in school by then and eating by myself in my office. And I thought, this is kind of strange. I really need to interact with people because good stuff goes on when you get a couple faculty members together. So I decided to crash the brown bag group. And the reception was less than warm. They would talk about things, interdepartmental things that I had no access to, that I had no knowledge of. They tried telling dirty jokes, so I just laughed. I was not offended. I know that men tell dirty jokes, so anyway. Sometimes I would try to interject some remarks into the conversation, and they would just ignore them, as if I hadn't said anything. But gradually, over a period of months, I became accepted into the brown bag group. It was almost noticeable the day they decided to give up resisting and accepted me and began responding to things that I said and so forth. And I recall that I gradually brought some other women into the group. I sort of waited till I thought it was safe to bring. I felt responsible for bringing another young new faculty member into a hornet's nest, so to speak. Actually, I think, a lot of college business goes on outside of faculty meetings. So it was very useful being part of the brown bag group. Eventually, a group of women on campus decided that maybe we needed a women's studies program. At first, we just got together to talk, and it included some prominent women in the administration as well as women faculty. We decided that we wanted to create a women's studies program and that we would take the discussion to the faculty as a whole and see what their response would be. One of the points we made was that women's studies was really applicable to many disciplines. I still remember my biology professors standing up and saying, I am a parasitologist. Can you explain to me how women's studies applies to my field? The woman who we had brought in from, I think her name was Peggy Apple. I don't remember. I didn't look it up. Anyway, she said, just very calmly, have you ever considered that possibly one gender could be a parasite on the other gender in your field, as well as some other fields? And there was dead silence. And then the women in the room began to clap. So that was a memorable moment. But the problem with teaching women's studies back then was that there were no existing women's studies programs. There were no degree programs in women's studies. Gradually, of course, these began to emerge. We decided that we would educate ourselves. And so it was a marvelous interdisciplinary group of women. By then, there were a lot more. We got a grant to meet together regularly over the summer. We each pursued feminist topics in our own disciplines or disciplines that interested us. For instance, I had people do readings on Vandana Shiva, who is a well-known Indian environmentalist. We would do the readings and then have a discussion on them. And we were doing that in lots of different disciplines: sociology, anthropology, French, English, both people in the social sciences and in the arts as well, in the literature and language disciplines. And when we did this maybe 3 or 4 summers before we felt we were ready to mount a program and create some courses. But when we finally set up an intro course in women's studies, we decreed that it had to be jointly taught by one from the social sciences and one from other disciplines. So it was always an interdisciplinary course. And it was a very, very successful course. And it's probably still being taught today, actually, if I'm not mistaken. So I was privileged, even as a part-timer, to participate in all of this and also to teach women's studies courses. But I never had a sabbatical. You know, all those years that I was a part-timer, when other people were getting sabbaticals every 7 years, I never had one. And so I really didn't have a lot of time to work on scholarship. But I did anyway. And I was eligible for travel grants. I will give that to the college. They allowed me to have research grants so that I could travel to India, and I could travel to women's studies conferences, and I could travel to International Peace Research Commission conferences in other parts of the world. And that way, I got around. In order to satisfy the feminist need for knowledge of other parts of the world. If I went to a conference in some other location, and I went to conferences in South Africa, I went to conferences in Korea, Haiti, all kinds of places, I would stay a week beyond the conference and meet with women's organizations there, so that I kind of became a specialist in international women's issues, which, to tell the truth, are not that much different from women's issues in the United States. But I began to teach courses then here that dealt with the international women's issues. I guess one of my proudest moments was when one of my students had some sort of a January internship in Switzerland at the International Red Cross, and they told her they had never had an intern who was so well versed in the issues facing women in other parts of the world. So I felt I was doing my job. There were perks to being even a part-time member of the Gettysburg faculty. After teaching full-time for a while, they decided I should have a tenure review. And so, stupid me, thinking I was really a wonderful interdisciplinary person, submitted my scholarship, which by the way was pretty prodigious. I'd done a lot. I've never written a book, but I'd written a lot of articles, published a lot of articles. I submitted some articles in women's studies. I submitted some articles in Indian literature. I submitted some articles in English literature that I had published. The verdict came back. You're too spread out, right? You're not focused enough. I could not believe what I was hearing. However, that's what happened. And so I was forced to retire when I hit age 65. I was certainly not ready to stop teaching. And I will say thanks to now deceased Paula Olinger for making sure that the Board of Trustees granted me Emerita status. It came with a little bit of money. It came with recognition that I could use the title Professor Emerita. I wanted to continue teaching. I didn't want to stop. So I knew all about part-time teaching. So I continued. After I formally retired, I continued teaching for 10 more years as a part-time faculty member, which is why I ended up with 49 years of teaching at Gettysburg College. And people often say to me, well, why didn't you go for 50? All I can say is I just knew it was time to stop. It was time to stop. But Since 2014, I have completed 3 books. One of them, Blossoms on the Olive Tree, dealing with Palestinian women and Israeli women working for peace. The second book, Kites Over the Mango Tree, dealt with India, because that was an area I was more familiar with, but with the dispute between Hindus and Muslims in the state of Gujarat. But I was interested in the peace process because there were 10 different organizations that worked together, both Hindu and Muslim and Christian, to try and bring about peace in the state of Gujarat. The third book I jointly wrote with my friend who was a Bosnian refugee, Marica Prozo. 17 years later, she wanted to go back. I was kind of interested in the women of Bosnia, so we cooked up a project. It took us 2 years to get funding for her to go, and we interviewed a lot of women in her hometown area and a lot of women in Sarajevo. The book that Marica and I wrote is called Circles on the Mountain, named after the Kolo dance. And even Sarajevo it's in a valley between 2 mountains, and all the houses are up on the hillsides. It's a city where you climb a lot of stairs going from one level to another. Beautiful city. I love going back there. I love going to the museums there. And it pains me that some of the tour companies now are taking people to Serbia and Croatia, but not to Bosnia, because it really should be visited too.
Thank you for listening to Jan's story. For more information on Jan and her books, please see the show notes. In the show notes, you will also find more information about this podcast, or visit our website at tellusastory.info.